We've seen disastrous decisions by political and military leaders throughout the war, but rarely have they been called to account. At least so far. But that changes this week. This week, Winston Churchill gets fired. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. When we left off, South African forces had captured the German colonial capital Windhoek. The British and French had jointly tried to break the German lines in Artois. The Germans were still attacking at Ypres and at Gallipoli. The Allied landings and anticipated victory had now descended into siege warfare. But the big news was on the Eastern Front, where the Austro-German Gorlice-Tarnow-Offensive had driven the Russians back from the Carpathians and erased 8 months of Russian gains. Let's look first to the west, where the Allies were yet again starting something new. Now, the Second Battle of Artois was in full swing. Indeed, the Germans were actually slowly calling a halt to their own offensive, the Second Battle of Ypres, to deal with the situation in Artois. This week in Artois, the Battle of Festubert, which lasted for 10 days, began May 15th. This was an attack by British forces and was really the first time they tried to win by attrition instead of the quick bite and hold tactics that they had been pursuing the last couple of months. So the attack began with a 3-day artillery barrage of over 100,000 shells, which still failed to do any serious damage to the German defensive lines. The initial infantry attacks afterwards were fairly successful initially, but as the weather turned bad, the British troops dug in as the Germans reinforced their new positions. So while the British gained some ground, around 3 kilometers, their losses for the battle were over 3 times that of the Germans, around 16,000 to around 5,000 casualties. Historian Peter Hart put it simply: it was a disaster. The British, it seemed, still had a great deal to learn about artillery support and multi-layered command and control structures. I think we all know, though, that the forces that had used artillery most effectively so far were the Germans, and they were bringing it on in full force over in the east. The battle for mid-Galicia was over when the Austro-German forces reached the San River, with the Russians the big losers. And this week saw the beginning of the Battle of the San, which also began a new chapter of the war. German General August von Mackensen was slowly advancing toward the fortress of Przemyśl, near where the Russian center under General Nikolai Ivanov held east of the river. I say slowly because Mackensen was leading 2,000 pieces of artillery with seemingly limitless ammunition. The Russians had been in full retreat for 2 weeks, and at this point, Ivanov's main objective was to hold off the enemy long enough to clear the fortress of supplies and ammunition and withdraw the troops holding it. On May 14th, German troops occupied Yaroslavl, some 40 kilometers from the fortress, and that same day, the Austro-Hungarian Fourth Army under Archduke Joseph Ferdinand reached the western banks of the San. By the 16th, the attackers held the left of the river from Yaroslavl to Rudnik, over 60 kilometers. That day, they began to take the right bank as well. A German division further north reached Lubachovska, and half a circle around Przemyśl was complete. The German goal now was to cut the Przemyśl-Lemberg railway and sabotage the Russian retreat from the fortress. But while the Germans were planning to take Przemyśl from the north, the actual battle opened to the south on the 15th, when Austro-German forces attacked the Russian lines between Nowe Miasto and Sambor. Much like on the Western Front, this was an area of trenches and barbed wire, and the trenches changed hands back and forth over the next few days. By May 21st, though, the attackers had broken through the Russian defenses east of Przemyśl, threatening the garrison's retreat and further closing a circle around the Russians as the Germans advanced from the north. Actually, by the 20th, Mackensen's forces were bombarding the fortress itself. However, on the 21st, Ivanov's forces counterattacked along the entire line in an attempt to save not the fortress itself, but the garrison within. The Russians were actually trying an enveloping movement of their own, and though they did capture quite a few guns, a bunch of prisoners, and a couple of towns, it was a lost cause. By the 24th, though the Russians continued to offer effective resistance as their counteroffensive petered out, the eventual fall of Przemyśl was a foregone conclusion, and that day, Mackensen resumed the offensive, taking Drohojov, Ostrov, Vysoko, Majkowisko, and Vietlin in the same day. When the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army was having its lunch eaten by the Russians in the Carpathian Mountains some 6 weeks ago, the Austrian powers that be were considering some sort of deal with Russia. But Germany now had pretty fair control over Austrian war policy, and war policy is what we're going to look at next, though not German, British. The British Liberal Party had so far had exclusive control of war policy, but the severe shell shortage over the past weeks caused Prime Minister Herbert Asquith to be pressed to establish a Ministry of Munitions and to give some senior places to his conservative opponents. Both parties now believed the war was above politics. Hooray! And it needed long-term planning and production. I mentioned last week that of 6 million artillery shells that the army should have received by May, they only got around 2 million. This, together with the British naval failure at the Dardanelles, caused Asquith to finally form a coalition government May 19th. The Conservatives demanded that First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, be removed from his post for the failures in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so he was. Arthur Balfour, a former Conservative Prime Minister, became the new First Lord. That same day, the 19th, at Gallipoli, an assault by 40,000 Turks was repulsed by fewer than half that number of Australians and New Zealanders. But here's the thing. Last month, when Gallipoli started, it was supposed to be a continuous forward assault, right? But now it had become a defensive struggle to hang on to a couple of footholds. The Turks may have been holding their own at Gallipoli, but they were losing ground further to the east. This week, the Russian army occupied villages throughout the Van district of eastern Anatolia, and on May 19th, advanced Russian troops reached the city of Van itself. The Armenian population of the city, 30,000 strong, had been under siege by Ottoman forces for a month, but as the Russians arrived, the siege was lifted. The Russian troops actually brought congratulations from the Tsar himself for the city's defenders. And in the days that followed, as the Russians began to cremate the dead in the province, 55,000 were identified as Armenians. This war was no picnic for civilians pretty much anywhere. And in a dark note from the British Isles, on May 14th, the internment of enemy aliens in Great Britain began. And that was the week, a pretty busy one everywhere now that spring had really arrived. The Russians still being pushed back by the Germans, trading positions with the Austrians and beating back the Ottomans. The British losing thousands of men in the west for a gain of a few thousand meters and losing one more man at home. Winston Churchill would have a brilliant career, and as Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II is rightly remembered as one of the great wartime leaders of the century, and was an inspiration to millions both during and after the war. Before and during the First World War, he wisely urged modernization of Britain's forces, insisting that all new ships be powered by oil and not by coal. He also foresaw the importance of airplanes in combat and was instrumental in establishing the Land Ships Committee in February 1915, whose work eventually created the tank. But Churchill had a darker side. Future Prime Minister Lloyd George would write to Churchill during the war, quote, "You will one day discover that your state of mind revealed is the reason why you do not win trust, even where you command admiration. National interests are completely overshadowed by your personal concern," end quote. And Churchill certainly had an ego. In 1904, First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher had determined that attacking the Dardanelles would be foolhardy. In 1906, War Minister Richard Haldane warned of the potential for disaster there. And in 1911, Churchill himself said it was not possible to force the Dardanelles. And yet, 4 years later, as First Lord of the Admiralty, he let his thirst for naval glory and involvement in the war to match that of the army lead him to Gallipoli and the loss of tens of thousands of men in a bloody waste of life. And that is unforgivable. One of the people that Churchill was trying to help out by forcing the Dardanelles was Tsar Nicholas II, and you can find out more about him in our bio of him right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is David Sabadin. If you want to find out more about supporting our show and get some cool perks on top of it, check out our Patreon page. And for more historical pictures, you can follow us on Instagram. See you next time.